We'll go into the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework discussion led by Vanessa Prefontaine from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Then we have Why Should We Care? Little discussion with Joey Tutusis, who is from Saskatchewan, and he was one of the co-founders of our group. Finally, we'll end the day with a little mini consultation of what does biodiversity mean to me, and we'll have a little conclusion. But before we introduce who we are, we have Kim Wheatley, who's an Anishinaabe traditional grandmother, who unfortunately can't be here today, but really wanted to kind of share a little words of wisdom. So if it's all okay with you guys, I'm going to share a video. I'm gonna stop screen sharing so I can make sure that this is optimized for video clips. And while we're listening to Kim's video, if everyone can turn off their mics just so that we can hear her loud and clear. I will begin.
Anin bojo kinawea. Greetings, my relatives. Mishike and Dodam Shkudenigan Wawaskonan Indigenous. Turtle Clan, and my spirit name is Head or Leader of the Fire Flower. In English, most people call me Grandmother Kim Wheatley. So happy to be with you here today. Shawanaga and Dunji. I live in Shawanaga First Nations Reserve, which is located right here in Ontario, about half an hour north of Parry Sounds from the Georgian Bay region. And I was asked to come and speak to each and every one of you here today about the lands, the waters, the work of inquiry that is being asked of each and every one of you to share a bit of your perspectives, your thoughts, and your heart-centered connections on making changes around the world connected to the one thing that unites us all, our mother, our first mother. And so in starting in a good way, I'm going to offer a bit of a smudge. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that process, it's the lighting of one of our sacred medicines. And it's just the way that we honor our ancestors, we honor each other. It enables us to speak in a good way. And so I'm going to cyber smudge each and every one of you. And I'll smudge myself. It's said that we can only speak the truth when we hold our eagle feathers and when we light our medicines. I want to acknowledge the treaty and traditional territory that I'm tuning in from, which belongs to the Chippewas of Georgina Island. I'm in Newmarket, and I wanted to encourage you to be present, to kind of put your feet flat on the ground, to take a couple of deep breaths, and really feel that air flowing through you. I wanted you to think about the mineral world, you know, all of the sands, the soils, the clays, the gravels, the rocks, the stone beings in the mountains, because these are this is the skin of the earth. This is what holds her together. And in our world, they are the most ancient beings on earth. They're the ones that know all the songs, the stories, the ceremonies that have ever been sung and or shared. And, you know, we give them thanks on a daily basis. So I encourage you to do that at this time, in whatever way, in whatever language, based on whatever values that you might have towards the earth herself. And then, you know, I want to bring our hearts and minds together and think about all of the plant beings, the ones who recognize me as relative. My name is Head or Leader of the Fire Flower. That's my spirit name, and they gave it to me. And I'm thinking about all of the grasses, the shrubs, the trees, the bushes, the hardwoods, the softwoods, the berries, the hanging fruits, and all of the medicines. When I think about all of these beautiful beings, and I think about how they nourish us, how they heal our bodies, how they protect us from the elements and provide endless beauty for our senses, it's hard not to be thankful. So I encourage you on this day to have an attitude of gratitude towards those beautiful beings. And then I want to bring our hearts and minds together and think about our elder brothers and sisters. I'm talking about the two-leggeds, the four-leggeds, the winged ones, the ones who swim in the water, the ones who fly up in the sky world, and the ones who crawl beneath the earth. These beings, they've been here longer than we have. And they're great teachers. They also sacrifice on a daily basis for our well-being. They have taught us much about the world and how to interact in a good way with a good heart and a good mind. And so on this day, I encourage you to give them greetings and thanks. And then I want to bring our minds together and think about the human race. The human family is our family. All the men and women and children that have ever been, that are here now, and that are on their way. When we think about our human family, there is so much to be thankful for. There's great diversity amongst us, and there's also great responsibility put upon us. And as babies on the planet, everything's about us, us, us. But we need to be thinking on a more global, impactful level. And we really have to decide how to be change makers for the future. And so on this day, I want to give thanks for all of your ancestors as I do mine. I want to give thanks for all the change and the submissions that you may provide. I want to encourage you to know that you are a superhero in some ways because you have this great medium, this electronic platform to engage with and to manifest real change that can ripple across the earth. And when we think about the earth and how powerful she is and what unites us all, it is this life force that's inside of this little cup. Inside of this copper cup is water. And water in a copper cup is considered sacred. It's a way of cleaning it up. And we honor water in our culture. One of the things we do for water is we tell her how much we love her, how much we thank her, and how much we respect her. We do that in a song. That song sounds like this. Nebe gizage higo gimi gwechuwe nemego gijawe nemego nebe water gizage higo water, we love you. Gimi gwechuwe nemego water, we thank you. Gijawe nemego water, we respect you. It's said that water is a living being and she responds to our words, to our emotions, to our thoughts. So what we think, what we say, what we do is very powerful. It's also the life force that is required for all of those orders of creation I talked about, the mineral world, the plant world, the animal world, and the human world. Water it's a right in our lives. It should not be a commodity, and yet so many of us across the earth do not have access to this amazing life source, the lifeblood of the earth herself. And we all have a responsibility in ensuring that that's not only accessible, but that it remains clean for the generations that'll come after us. So I encourage you to pause for a moment to think about your relationship to water and think about how you could manifest some real support systems, some real changes for water, like assigning it personhood and having that acknowledged in the courts of laws across this planet. New Zealand has done it. I'm sure the rest of us could jump on board. When it's legally recognized with personhood, it means it's protected. And we need to protect her. We need to do our part. We've caused so much harm. It's time to flip the switch and go to the other end of the spectrum. I believe we're capable of doing that. I also believe that we are responsible for doing that. So as you are asked to contribute and to share your thoughts about how to benefit the greater good, and we're talking about everybody on the planet, and we're talking about all beings on the planet as well. Think deeply. Speak from your heart. Know that you are a change maker, and know that you will truly make a difference. I believe in you. I trust you. As an older generation, I apologize for giving you an earth that's less than pristine. But please know that I stand behind you in supporting the changes that you see, the visions you have, right up until 2050. This is amazing to think that far ahead, and for many of you, that doesn't seem like something you can even really envision at this point. But it's not so long off. And who knows how beautiful the world can become with the changes that are encouraged and supported by so many youth across the planet today. I'm going to close with a song. I'm going to thank you for listening. I hope I've inspired you, and I sincerely hope that you will leave this experience and this very minor teaching better than when you came. I love the natural world, and I love all the teachers that come from it. And I want you to know that I believe not only in you, but in them as well. And so when I sing our songs, I'm singing to the spirit of those beings. This song is a buffalo song, the one who teaches us about breath and life and how important that is, how beautiful it is, how powerful it is. And maybe it will inspire you as well. Use your voice, use it wisely. Know that your voice has power. Thank you. I send that out to the 4 cardinal directions on the planet, no matter where you come from, no matter who you are, what you believe in, what faith you practice. I send this with the deepest of my respect, the deepest of my gratitude for sitting with me, and the greatest of my hopes that you will embrace the fact that you are superheroes and magnificent forces of change for the future. Be well, everybody. I wish you peace of mind, good health, and good long life. This is Grandmother Kim Wheatley saying Ba Mon Pi till I see you again. Be well.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm going to share my screen again. So Miigwech Kim, she was absolutely amazing, and we're very grateful that she was able to speak, and she will certainly get our biggest gratitude. But now to introduce ourselves. Hello, my name's Alex, and these are some of the coordinators and volunteers who were able to put this consultation on. Just to give you a little bit of information about our group, we are a platform aimed to connect young people all over Canada for the common protection of biodiversity. We've done a lot of different projects, but all of them aimed to enhancing the capacity and respect that biodiversity has. Regardless of where you come from, cultural background, educational background, economic background, and even sexual orientation, we feel that everyone should have the opportunity to speak about these important issues, because at the end of the day, it's on our shoulders. If you're interested about learning about us and our past projects, you can visit us at CYBN.ca. We're also an active chapter of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. The Global Youth Biodiversity Network is made up of individuals and youth organizations across the entire world and all active on biodiversity. They're an international coordination platform for youth participation on the Convention on Biological Diversity, which they'll be introduced later on. They do this through different youth-led activities like empowerment, youth capacity building, advocacy and campaigning, and mobilization and actions. We're very grateful for the Global Youth Biodiversity Network empowering us to put on these consultations. So huge shout out to Gibbon. But this leads us to what our goals are for the consultation. So we hope to understand and hear your opinions about biodiversity and what you would like to see in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Day one specifically is about providing you guys the knowledge and background if you're not exactly comfortable with the topic. And it'll give you enough confidence for day two, which will be really deep dive into the consultation. At the end of this, we're hoping to provide a report that will be contributing to Gibbon's national youth position, as well as it'll lead to a discussion on intergenerational relationships afterward. Just a reminder before we head into our speakers, if everyone could turn off their mics, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And this is being recorded so that we can study this later. So if you're not comfortable being on camera, you're absolutely welcome to turn your screen, cameras off. But I'm going to hand it now to Anushka, one of our volunteers, to introduce the speakers. Anushka?
Thanks, Alex. So now let's welcome our first speaker, Melina Sakhiyama, who will talk about biodiversity. Melina is a Brazilian biologist and holds a master's degree in environmental management from Kyoto University in Japan. She has been involved in numerous research projects on biodiversity conservation, biodiversity evaluation, and education for sustainable development. She also volunteered for various social and environmental organizations. She is a founding member of CYBN and has coordinated youth participation in the CBD since 2012. Since 2014, she is coordinating GYBN's Youth Voices Capacity Building and Empowerment Program. Welcome, Melina.
Hello, everyone. Is my connection good enough? Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. I just needed like an authorization. Yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Share my screen. Thank you. So, okay, thank you. So just gonna share it now. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, guys, and it's such a pleasure for me to be here. I was not very well, so I know that my confirmation to give this presentation was very like last minute, but I'm glad to be here with all of you guys and to see so many people excited and really wanting to participate, to join forces, and to have like all of us like as a collective movement to try and sort it out this mess that we are in. So today I would like to talk to you a little bit about the story of biodiversity. And I wanted to start with you guys, like with a little bit of a reflection about what do you think you need to live? But I mean to live fully, you know, not just survive, but to live fully. So if you can just take a couple of minutes, like, I mean, maybe 1 minute, because I don't have a lot of time, to think a little bit and to try to put down in the chat box like some of the things, like the feelings, the materials or whatever, like that you think you need, okay, to live. And then like we will continue. So I would just put the chat so that I can see a little bit. And it is really amazing, like all the places in Canada that you are coming from. And for me, it's such an honor to speak after Grandmother King. Yes, like trees, food, health, environment, water, air, wilderness, soil, yes. So that's great, that shelter, that you guys are thinking a little bit about it. Now, I can see that a lot of you guys thought of some of the things that are in the screen right now. So some of you were thinking about like the food that can give us the sustenance, like the joy that food gives many of us, I suppose, like, but also how all the biodiversity can contribute to our health. So like through medicines, through like all sorts of like well-being issue materials as well. But some of you pointed out like systems, so like for instance like water purification or climate regulation. These are also a couple of services that nature provides to us, right? And like such as pollination as well, like air, carbon, exactly. So, and then maybe you guys also thought a little bit more about like the feelings and about other things like the nature can provide to us, that can be a lot of comfort and it can bring us a lot of well-being. So for instance, like music, like how music is so connected to nature and the arts and like tradition and customs and spirituality. So as Kim was saying, a lot of like, especially for Indigenous people, their spirituality is very connected to nature, right? And so all of this is part of biodiversity, and this is all underpinning this big web of life in which we are big parts of it, but also like we are there together collectively with everything else, with every other living being, right? And then like if we go a little bit more scientific, I'm not sure what is exactly your background, but I'm a biologist. So this is kind of how we say what biodiversity is this web of life, like we're part, we depend on it. And it's all the species in our planet, their genetic diversity that is within their chromosomes, but it's also like the ecosystems that are formed by those species, right? And you have to look at it as not an aesthetic thing. It's like this dynamic balance of a species coming in, going out, getting extinct, like evolving, right? So it's the whole tree of life. And then it contains all this billions of years of history, of evolutionary history that has generated what we are seeing today and which we are all part of it, okay? So like, and that all of this is underpinning what we are calling like ecosystem services or like nature contribution to people, which can be divided and classified in many different ways, but this is more or less like what has been agreed. So it's supporting services, cultural services, provisional services, and regulating services, okay? And then let's not forget that while like a lot of this bounty of essential goods and services are being provided by nature, like one of the things that people value the most about it is its social, cultural, spiritual, and religious significance. Okay, so it's like your languages, it's like your expressions, like your culture, okay, and that this plays much more of a role than what we usually think. Okay, because we are so focused on the material world that we sometimes forget all of that. And then we cannot forget neither that all of this biodiversity, especially nowadays now, is found in the lands and waters that are managed, owned, and under the control of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So the standard of living, the well-being that we achieve today in the cities, like comes from Indigenous people protecting and managing their territories, because that's where most of the biodiversity hotspots, which are the places on Earth that contains the largest variety, richness of biodiversity, but it's also like where the Indigenous people develop this relationship with their lands, and therefore they can manage it so well, okay? So these are what we are calling like the territories of life. And then like we can go more over like this theme also throughout the consultation. And so all of this is forming our life support system, okay? And like we are part of it. But then like what is going on? So hello Anthropocene, right? Like this is what we are doing. So as you can see, it's a bunch of statistics like from social side, so where population, like what else? Fertilizer consumption. So it's measures like statistics related to our technically our development, our technological use, our production, and then like natural system statistics like carbon, like methane, like ocean acidification, tropical forest loss. And then you can see a steep increase like close to after the Second World War, right? So this is where like globalization really started, like, and sort of like really we started to kind of go way, way, way beyond like the normal production and so on, and the growth, right? And this is what the scientists are calling Anthropocene, because that is the moment where human beings and the way they are treating the earth, the way their relationship with the earth has shifted and is affecting and impacting it in a scale and a scope never thought before. Okay, so we are changing geological history on Earth, and that's why they are calling it the Anthropocene. And these are just a bunch of statistics, right? And then like you might be thinking why this is happening, what is moving this? And then it's basically this kind of like more and more and more concept. The moment that we start to produce things just for profit or mainly for profit and not anymore based on people's needs, it means that we will be consuming, producing, extracting, developing, and so on, much more, right? So never before on Earth, we kind of moved things around the world so much and produced things in the scale that we are produced today so much. Okay, so this is the main reasons why this is happening. And then if you think a little bit more deep into it, does all these things get distributed equally? Like, not, right? We are witnessing now with the pandemic more and more how all of this is being unequally distributed, and not only the benefits. So it's not only like the good food or like the good technology or like everything like that you can produce with like the timber or the minerals from our planet, but the bearing of the costs, so the negative impacts of this exploitation, so like the mining, you know, like the deforestation, the overfishing, this gets in the hands of like the people that are usually protecting it, right? So who are feeling most of those impacts is the people that have nothing to do with the benefits, right? So this is kind of like really the unfairness story behind biodiversity, if we can say like this. And like you can see more clearly in the map, for instance, this is the map of like the ecological footprint, and the redder it is, the more resources it's consuming, and the greener it is, like the less resource is consuming, right? The lower the footprint. So you can see, and then those are the regions that are the poorest also, right? So you can start to see that the story of biodiversity is not just like how many species we have and what is going on with the ecosystem, but it's about our relationship with it because we are part of it, okay? And now if you go a little bit more cynical, perhaps, these are a little bit of like the richest men, no, like, and you can see most of them are like white old men, right? Like, so like they have so much money, you know, that it's like more than like half of the world population, for instance. And like, so this is what is going on in the world today. So imagine all these resources, like all this biodiversity, the nature is being exploited, processed to become things to be sold to us, and then to make these people rich, and like the whole other people sort of living in poverty, right? And we are seeing how the poverty levels are increasing at the moment with the pandemics, and the number of billionaires is also increasing, like, right? Really bizarre situation that we are looking at. And then what is at stake? What it is that we see a huge decline in the species population. So the population of wildlife, so this is being monitored by WWF, is the Living Planet Index. I recommend you guys to see the report. It's really, really didactic, and it's really helpful to understand a little bit of the global picture, what is happening with our wildlife, okay? But not just the wildlife. Like we are witnessing 1 million species on the brink of extinction, right? And this is also like coming from the IPBES Global Assessment Report, which I also really recommend you guys to take a look, at least of the policy executive summary. I'll be talking a little bit more about that. IPBES is also this international platform, like intergovernmental platform, sorry, on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And they have been compiling a lot of the best knowledge available. And I'm saying here knowledge and not just science, because it's one of the first time that a big intergovernmental platform, scientific platform, is trying to incorporate the knowledge of Indigenous people. So the traditional knowledge and other knowledge systems from other groups of people that not just Western scientists can contribute to us understanding the world. And so they came up with this framework that is called nature's contribution to people. So that we stop like commodifying nature so much and like, you know, making it just based on the function that nature provides to us or on the services, but it's more like the contributions to people's well-being. Okay, and then as you can see here, like it's similar to the ecosystem services, but it's a more humanistic approach to it. And if you see all the arrows, they are down, which means that we are having a decline of all these amazing contributions that we get from nature, except three. And if you see the trees here, energy, food and feed and materials and assistance. So basically what we are doing is that we are transforming all these contributions and processing that through industry into these three things. And like now I ask all of us, is that a good thing? Like not, right? So it's not only the wildlife that is at risk or all the populations, but it's the contributions that are coming to us from nature that are at risk. And like they are looking at this, and this is what we are mostly familiar with, right? Acidification, mining, forest fires, and COVID pandemic, because this is also like being a result of like it's a zoonotic disease that results on like deforestation, right? And this is a threat to people as well. So like as I said before, these are the people, indigenous people, local communities, they're living at the frontier of this exploitation, right? And I come from Brazil, one of the countries that has the largest percentage of tropical forest. And I receive message every day from my friends, activists that are working with indigenous people, like that every week at least, you know, like somebody's disappearing, somebody's getting murdered, somebody, you know, like some population is at risk. So it's really, really sad what is going on at this moment, especially with the pandemic, okay? So like it's a threat to every one of us. And like considering that these are the people that are conserving most of our resources at the moment, most of our nature, like we will be in a very complicated situation. And this is the whole dimension of the social ecological crisis. So a lot of the media, a lot of the politicians, a lot of the older generations, like they like to say like, no, we're living a climate crisis or we're living in an environmental crisis. But the reality is that we are in a social ecological mess, because you cannot detach and say like, yeah, we're just losing biodiversity without talking about justice and equity and like, you know, and like the sort of the social problems that we are living. Because the loss of biodiversity or the climate crisis or the ocean crisis is deeply rooted on our social inequalities, on the social injustice, right? Our values and priorities. So if those don't change, we won't be able to change the crisis, right? So what now? And I'm just gonna go a little bit faster here because this will be covered throughout your conversations and throughout your consultations. But I just wanted to kind of like give you a little bit of an insight about like what young people have been talking so much about it, and what we at the Giving community been discussing so much in throughout all these consultations that we are having in the world, right? Like throughout chapters. So it is about this true transformation. How can we achieve this change towards sustainability, right? And IPES, like they started to talk about like a transformative change that can need to be profound, systemic, strategic, and reflexive. And then they started to go throughout the literature and throughout the knowledge available, and they started to find very interesting things. For instance, successful change will never happen easily or spontaneously. So if we just wait, you know, to see change coming, it won't happen, right? So it will require broad and intense effort, and will also need a very good understanding of local to global human and natural system dynamics. So how the relationship between like our locality, our communities, and the global systems, the global trade is happening. Okay. And another thing also is that we will only achieve this change if we challenge the establishment and ourselves. So everything will start with a personal self-reflection on our side, okay, to try to understand how we are going to face the resistance, this power imbalance. And like we need to acknowledge and understand that this system is functioning in this way because somebody or some group or some sort of entity, right, interests are being satisfied. Okay, so there is always going to be a resistance. So this is what we always have to keep in our sights, and we need to take a deep breath, right, because these things are very, very complex, and if we want simple quick fixes, quick solutions, we won't be able to get anywhere because we will be lost and we will be swallowed by the system back again. So unless we are willing to embrace complexity, we won't get anywhere. I'm just gonna turn on my light because it's a bit dark. So sorry. So like here is the beginning of everything, right? The root causes. So like I'm just kind of like bringing in a lot of concepts. I know it's kind of like difficult and you guys might need time to digest it, but this is what I'm my role here today. I'm kind of wanting to provoke, you know, and poke around our conceptions of the reality and what we have been taught, okay, and let our youthfulness, you know, like just kind of get liberated so that we can think by ourselves and together collectively, like we can discuss and come out with the things that we really want and we really think it's important, okay? So what most of the people understand is those direct drivers. So these direct drivers are causing the loss of biodiversity and our ecological crisis. And we all know about that, okay? But what really matters is those indirect drivers, okay? And how these indirect drivers are actually the ones behind the direct drivers. And then what the scientists and experts around are figuring out, which is very, very, very intuitive, is that obviously is the way we value things. It's our behaviors. And then these things in column here, like so the demographics, the social, the society, the culture, the economics, the technology, the government institutions, they are all gonna be shaped by our values and priorities. So if our value is money only or profit first or consumerism, what kind of governance system we will have, what kind of technology we will have, what kind of economy we will have, what kind of culture we are producing, right? So this is how you guys should try to think, okay? So it's not necessarily that technology is bad, but technology that has a priority that profit first is gonna be bad because then we're gonna create all these phones and like computers that only last 3 years, and then it's a huge waste. Or worse, we're going to create technology that is actually worse for our environment and for our own health, right? So this is the way like that maybe it would be more helpful for us to look at this crisis. And then like when you start to see these many layers of like relationship between like causes and effects, and like understand a little bit more of all the social, political, and cultural considerations, you will start to see some levers, like some leverage points, which are those points that if you make a little bit of an effort, like you will have more rewards. So you will get more impact out of it, okay? And this I took out from the IPA's Global Assessment Report, and it's a little bit complicated, their language, but there is an executive summary that you can read, but I tried to kind of like make it more understandable, okay? So the experts, they like found out a couple of those leverage points, okay, that if we are able to use them in our activities, if we are able to do that in like a bigger scale through governments, through policy, through like planning, maybe we will be able to reach this transformative change that we want. Okay, so one of the first things that they said is that to
Sorry, Melina, to interrupt you. Can you wrap up in a minute, please?
okay, I'll go really fast. So I'm just gonna go kind of fast, and then like maybe at another point we can discuss it a little bit more in depth. But this is exactly about appreciating other visions of good life. Okay, so everybody, like we are following majorly like the Western way, but there are tons of indigenous communities of other cultures that might have different answers for the questions that we have at the moment. So this is the meaning of a diverse vision of good life. And then the other like lever that they found, the leverage point, is to reduce inequalities and to ask those questions like who is gaining, who is losing, who has access, who has rights, whose word vision matters, and not never forget that inequality will exacerbate biodiversity loss, and biodiversity loss will keep exacerbating inequality. Okay, and then the conversation on inequality, it comes the issue of justice and inclusion and conservation. And like the whole point that we Westerners, or like the modern people sort of thing, urban people, we need to recognize who has done more for conservation. And like if we are true, like if we're really like fair, like, and a lot of the scientists are now realizing that those have been the communities that have been living in those territories. So like their views on this really matter, but at the moment they are mostly excluded from all of this political conversation, right? And then we need to also understand these indirect relationships between where things are produced and where they will have an impact, and where people are going to have benefits and where they are going to be suffering because of the production, which is called telecouplings. And then like this is the basic of the basic. We need an education that is transformative, because we need an education that is focused on changing our values or challenging our worldviews, and inculcating critical thinking, so that we can keep understanding our relationship with each other and with our planet, and keep finding the solutions and the pathways for us to live in harmony with nature, right? And then another thing is about sustainable and just technology. So as we were mentioning before, like a technology that is just following like not very good principles and values is going to lead to more like damage. So how can we reform technology so that it's really just and sustainable? And then reducing, recycling, all the R's, I think we are very aware of. And this is the last thing that I really wanted to make the point of. And I think this is really important for young people, which is what IBES is calling unleashing values and actions. So what they found out is that the majority of people, they are good and they want to do good. If they were given the choice, they would choose to do absolutely all the good things for the environment. The problem is that they are not being given the choice, and they are not being given the opportunities. And the opportunities are only going to be built if the people in power, the decision makers, can really build up what they are calling social infrastructures, okay? So programs, policies, investments that will enable the people to do what they really want to do, which is the good. So when like we blame and say like, oh, the fault of the environmental crisis is us humans, like they put everybody together, you know, and then they try to like dissolve, like sort of like disperse the responsibility, when in reality, the people that actually have the responsibility are those in power, are those at the position that can make those social infrastructure or don't make those social infrastructure.
Melina, I'm so sorry, but unfortunately we do have to get things going, just because we've got other speakers. But I want to ask you, is it possible to share your presentation?
Yes, I will send it to you guys. But basically, that's it. If there's any questions, you can just pass it on to me. Okay. And yeah, basically, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think
Christian,
if they can
talk about it.
send any messages just as any private questions, but we will have at the very end a chance for questions. So thank you so much, and I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm really sorry. It's
No,
just
that's
very
okay.
like
Happens.
too slower. Yeah, faster. Okay, thank you so much, guys, and I'm really sorry for that. But
When
yeah.
you're passionate about a topic. So everyone give a round of applause to Melina. She's killing it. I'm just going to share my screen, Anushka.
Okay. Thanks so much, Melina, for your talk. It was wonderful. So moving forward, now I would like to invite Christian for introducing us to Convention on Biological Diversity. So Christian is one of the founders of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network and has dedicated most of his life to working on biodiversity and environmental issues. In recognition of his accomplishments in biodiversity policy and advocacy, he has been appointed as Youth Ambassador for the UN Decade on Biodiversity. Welcome, Christian.
Okay, hello everybody. Now I feel shy to turn on my camera because that picture that you've just seen is over 10 years old. I wish I would still look that young. I have clearly aged a little bit over the years, but I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for this wonderful event. Thank you to CYBN for organizing this. I'm really, really happy. Normally, I'm super privileged that I can go to Canada every year to attend CBD meetings. That has not been the case since 2019, so I'm really sad about this. I miss your country a lot. And yeah, I'm glad that we can at least connect virtually. I will share my screen and give you hopefully a very quick presentation so that we can make up some time about the beautiful world of CBD. I just have to go back to my first slide, and here we are. Okay, so Melina has always the pleasure to give you a little bit of the big picture, talking about biodiversity, why it is important, what is all going wrong. And now you have to stand me talking about technicalities and how we're trying to clean up this mess and how we're making some success here and there, but we could do more. I'll try to keep it interesting. All right. We start with some history. Back in 1992, we had the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. And this is one of the most important environmental events that took place in the last decades. And it's still shaping how we're doing environmental policy today. And the key results of this meeting are 3 multilateral environmental agreements. The first is the UN Climate Agreement, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. Many of you have heard about it. There is also the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, the UN CCD, and then there is the beautiful Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. So 92 is when all of this started, and I guess this is before many of us have even been born. There are 3 objectives that are guiding the work of the CBD, and you can already see they're pretty general. We have the first objective, which is the conservation of biological diversity. Then we have the sustainable use of biodiversity. And the third one is already a bit more complex, and there's a lot of debate on whether we're making good progress or not in achieving that particular goal. And that's about the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources. I'll talk about this a little later. All right, this is an overview of all the countries that have joined the CBD, and you can see pretty much every country has joined the CBD. Was 2 exceptions actually. The one is the Vatican, and the other one is the United States for a number of political reasons. We can debate this for a long time. In the last 4 years when Trump was in office, it certainly made some things easier. But obviously, it also makes things more complicated because everything that we decide in the CBD applies to all the member states, with the exception of the US because they're not on board. Why is the CBD important? You have seen it's an almost 30-year-old international environmental agreement. It has these 3 overarching goals, but what does it actually do? And I know it's not as much as we want, but it's an important step forward, because for the first time, all the countries of the world have come together to decide that we want to stop business as usual, that we agree on one common goal, and that is to halt the loss of biodiversity. And this is enshrined in the text of the CBD. What the CBD also does is that it gives governments a mandate to take action on biodiversity. Many countries had that before, but it is really something that only through the CBD became a stronger international mandate that required countries to take action. Then what is equally important is that the CBD provides a space for government representatives, civil society, indigenous people, businesses to come together and to have dialogues about biodiversity, to collaborate, to identify ways how we can do more to protect it all together. And this global marketplace, this exchange place, is a very important function of the CBD. And then last but not least, the CBD creates standards. Before, every country was doing kind of their own thing when it came to biodiversity protection. There were different standards. There were some standards that were more or less harmonized in Europe, but there was no global standard on how we're going to make sure that everybody's going into the same direction and that we have the same understanding of what we are supposed to do. And this is also where the CBD comes in. It creates this space where we can come up with joint standards. These are some of the areas that the CBD focuses on, but it's certainly not everything. But just like so that you have an idea of the many areas that the CBD is active in. You can also see there are many issues that are cross-cutting, that are affecting more than one area. And here the CBD is also pretty active, and Canada is actually championing a lot of these issues. One example is gender and biodiversity, where Canada has a very strong standing. And I hope when Vanessa gives her presentation, she can tell you a little bit more about this, because here it's really great that your country is speaking out for mainstreaming gender into the CBD and biodiversity issues in general. The CBD is being administrated by a secretariat that is based in your beautiful country in Montreal. And it's a pretty bureaucratic body, but it's very important because it organizes all the meetings, it prepares all the documents, and there are basically, I think, 75 people working full-time and a number of people working as consultants. I think all in all, it's 150 people that are making sure that the CBD can work and bring all these governments together. So a very, very important body. And if you have the opportunity, it's all very friendly people. When the pandemic is over, hop over to Montreal, visit the Secretariat. There's a lot that you can learn. The heart of the CBD is certainly the Conference of the Parties, which is a meeting that takes place when we don't have COVID every 2 years, where all the different government representatives are coming together to adopt decisions on how we can turn the CBD into concrete action. And here it's important to understand that the CBD is what we refer to as a framework convention. It provides a broad framework, but how we fill this framework is up to each government. And this is why we have these COP meetings, so that we can update decisions, that we can agree on common goals and targets that we want to achieve together. And then what I also want to highlight are national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Again, a term that sounds horribly complicated, but it's actually quite simple. National biodiversity strategies and action plans are planning instruments that can have all shapes and forms. They can come in the form of a national conservation initiative. They can come in the form of a set of legislation that is not necessarily connected to each other, but that addresses different aspects of biodiversity conservation. It can also come in the form of efforts to mainstream, to integrate biodiversity into other policies, for instance, into subsidies policies for the agriculture sector. Yeah, so there are a number of important elements that national biodiversity strategies can bring. And what is important to note here is it is mandatory for every party that joins the CBD to create a national biodiversity strategy and action plan. All right. Well, then another instrument that is very important in this context is the strategic plan of the CBD. Roughly every 10 years, all the member states, we call them parties to the CBD, are coming together to adopt strategic plans that give a little bit of midterm guidance to the CBD so that we have a clear direction in which we're going. The last time this happened was in 2010 when a COP meeting took place in Nagoya. And at this conference, we adopted the 20 so-called Aichi biodiversity targets. Melina and I were there, a couple of others were there. And I remember this as a moment that we were incredibly proud of, where we were celebrating, where we were happy about how ambitious all these targets were. And we were really hoping that this could be a moment where we would be changing course. However, 10 years later, it looks like this. You can see all the yellow and the red arrows. And in general, we have made very, very little progress, unfortunately. That's for a number of reasons. The first reason is probably that the political momentum, the willingness of governments to act slowly died down a little bit after Nagoya. And there was not so much political priority given to biodiversity. Then there was also a problem that all these goals and targets were defined on the international level in a very top-down process. And there was not, from my point of view, interaction with people that work on the ground, that understand the problems. And this is also something that we need to change. We need to work more bottom up. We need to involve more parts of the society. And another reason, there are many more, is also the lack or the lack of sufficient resources to implement this. Only 2 years after Nagoya in 2012, we adopted a resource mobilization strategy for the CBD that was focusing on how are we going to fund implementation of all these targets. So that was 2 years in which we couldn't do something. And when it was adopted, the resources were flowing very slowly. And you just have to see that there is an enormous north-south divide in the availability of resources. For a rich country like mine, I'm from Germany, or like yours, Canada, or several other developed countries, it is not so complicated to find resources to protect biodiversity. It is still a challenge because we have to see that in few countries, environmental ministries are the most powerful ones. But it is easier than for a country like, let's say, Uganda or Madagascar. And it is important that there is a system of solidarity where rich countries afford those countries that need support. And you've seen that on Melina's slide. Most of the biodiversity is concentrated in the global south. And this transfer of resources from the north to the south didn't really work out the way it should have. I'm going to finish in a second, but I just want to highlight two things. You see there are a couple of green arrows where we have made progress. So for instance, we have actually made quite some progress with our targets for protected areas, which said that 17% of land areas should be conserved or 10% of the marine areas. This looks good, but it looks only good on paper because just because we can say on paper that we have protected 17% doesn't say anything about how these protected areas are being managed. What about the rights of indigenous people? Have indigenous people been evicted in order for us to create protected areas? Is anybody making sure that there is really protection of the species, of the ecosystems happening inside the protected areas? So my call for you and also for the rest of the consultation is be skeptical. There is a lot of reason for us to be hopeful, for us to make sure that we have learned from these mistakes, that we can make it better this time around. But it's also important that we are out here as young people, as watchdogs, and remind governments of their responsibility and remind them that they cannot just sneak away with just coming up with some numbers that are only valid on papers. We need real action on the ground. We need systemic changes. And that's why I'm so happy that so many of you are here, because I think you are the people that will bring this change, that will remind decision makers. And I'm also very, very happy that we have a member of the government speaking after me, because we are all in this together. We cannot just do this alone as young people. We have to really do this and perceive it as an intergenerational challenge. Sorry. I want to leave it like this here. I think Vanessa is carry on with Post-2020. So thank you so much for your time. I hope I haven't gone too much over time. And I'm wishing you a lot of luck for and success for the rest of your consultation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian, for your talk. We do have a few questions for you in the chat, but we are running out of time. So it would be great if we can answer those questions through chat. And let's take a quick 5-minute break, and then we will start a discussion and talk about post-2020 framework.
Please don't leave the call. We encourage everyone to stretch their legs, to get a snack, to breathe some fresh air. But if everyone leaves the call and comes back in, it'll take too much time. So by 10 minutes after the hour, we'll meet back together, depending on where your time zone is. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to post it in the chat, and hopefully we can answer your questions. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, everyone. So welcome back, everyone. And let's continue our session and invite our next speaker, Vanessa Prefontaine. And Vanessa will talk about Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So Vanessa is a policy analyst at Environment and Climate Change Canada, Canadian Wildlife Services, where she contributes to the elaboration and the negotiation of Canadian positions at the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. She graduated from the University of Ottawa with a bachelor's degree in environmental sciences with a major in conservation and biodiversity. And she earned her master's degree from the University of Sherbrooke, a major in international ecology. Welcome, Vanessa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so happy to be with you. I'm a representative from the Government of Canada, but I also still fit under the youth definition according to the UN. So I'm super happy to be here and contribute to the discussions today. And thank you, Melina and Christian, for those presentations. Very insightful and passionate, and I hope that I will be able to contribute to the presentation as well. I will share my screen, but have two screens, so I have to make sure that I'm sharing the right one. Can someone confirm that they're seeing the presentation and not my face?
Yeah.
Okay, good. My presentation is not as fun and interactive as the other one. It's very government straightforward, so apologies if it's not as interactive, but I'll try to make it fun. I'm here to talk to you about the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that Christian briefly mentioned before, and also a little bit of our Canadian perspective and how the Government of Canada has been approaching this process and some of our initial views on what is currently being proposed. So I will go over this slide very briefly because Christian already done such a great job at presenting what we have done in the past. So like you've said, in 2010 in Japan, countries, I wasn't there at the time, but countries have adopted the 2011-2020 Aichi biodiversity targets. And now that these targets have come to an end, we need to negotiate a new set of global targets. What do we want to achieve for the next decade and the future for future generations? Speaking of future generations, I apologize in advance if you hear some screaming babies in the background. We're doing this for them, but also for biodiversity itself. And so in COP15 in 2018, parties have decided that we needed a new framework to work from, and we should be building on the experiences that we've learned over the last decade. And so parties have adopted a decision to come up with a process that we've called the open-ended working group, where basically it's a group where every country is open to participate in, that is co-chaired by a representative from a developing country, which in this case happened to be a representative from Canada, Radil Van Hav, and a representative from a developing country, Francis Ogwal from Uganda. And then the process, the open-ended working group, is set to work, as the name says, for a limited period of time between COP14 and COP15 to help develop this response, this new framework for the global community for biodiversity. And so they've come up with a number of different meetings and processes. Thus far, there's been some regional consultations, some thematic workshops on, for example, marine and ocean, on the linkages between biodiversity and climate change, on agricultural practices, and so on. There has been 2 official meetings of the group, and the third one is planned to happen this summer, technically in early August, but with COVID, there's always a little bit of unknown. With that, of course, we need substance to negotiate on. We need something to help support our what we're gonna do for the next decade. And so the co-chair has released what they call an updated zero draft for the post-2020. That was released, the latest version, the updated version was released in September 2021. And this is what parties will be negotiating at the third meeting of the OEWG. So if we go a little bit into details about what this updated zero draft is and what it means for the global community, it's a pretty, I have to say, it's a pretty heavy document. There's a lot in there, but biodiversity is complex and you can't cover it with just a few lines. And so it goes into, you'll have to bear with me a little bit here. I'll go into a little bit of the weeds of this updated zero draft. The first thing is a 2050 vision to live in harmony with nature. And then it goes into 4 long-term 2050 goals for biodiversity with associated 2030 milestones. So the 4 goals are around ecosystem services, species, and ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity. So that's kind of the 3 layers of biodiversity. Then we go into human needs. The benefits shared, as Christian said, so it's kind of covering all 3 major objectives of the convention. And of course, we have to talk about means of implementation. How are we going to pay for this? How are we going to support countries that don't have the capacities to pay for it? How are we going to report against our progress, and so on? And then the framework goes into 20 action targets for 2030. So a little bit the equivalent of the Aichi targets, which I'll go into a little bit more details on the next slide. All of this is underpinned by considerations for means of implementation. So transparency, raising awareness, communication, considerations for Indigenous peoples, local communities, gender, youth, and so on. And this, of course, is supported by, so we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to report against our targets? It's good to set them, but how are we knowing if we're going to make progress against these targets? So this whole framework is also supported by what they call a monitoring framework, which I will come back to as well later. So if we go into a little bit more details about the 20 targets, they're separated into 3 main thematic areas. So reducing the threats of biodiversity. So there's a lot to cover, as I said. So you have spatial planning, you have protected areas, you have wild species, you have wild harvesting, you have invasive alien species, you have pollution, you have climate change as the major threats to biodiversity that have been highlighted by the IPBES report that are trying to be tackled with these targets. And then we go into the second section on meeting people's needs, so the ecosystem services. So how do we make sure that how we're harvesting biodiversity and using biodiversity is not detrimental to biodiversity, and making sure that we will have biodiversity for future generations. So sustainable use, sustainable management in productive sectors, provision of ecosystem services, access to blue and green spaces, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. And then we go into the tools and solution to implement this framework. So everything that is kind of indirectly related to biodiversity. So the policies, the planning, supply chains, consumption patterns, biotechnology, financial resources, harmful subsidies, information, traditional knowledge, awareness, communication, and then the inclusion, as I said earlier, of Indigenous peoples, local communities, youth, and women. So as you can see, the post-2020 GBF, as we so call it, tries to cover a lot, which is it should, because biodiversity is so encompassing. And then if we go into more details about this famous monitoring framework that I was referring to, it's a document that's going to be up for negotiation in upcoming meetings, actually just over within a few weeks from now. And then the monitoring framework has proposes three types of indicators. So there is headline indicators that parties we think that parties are going to be asked to report against, that they're going to be somewhat mandatory. There's going to be component indicators, because of course you can't cover everything with one or two headline indicators. So a target is usually complex. It has multiple levels and implications. So component indicator would come and make sure that everything that is encompassed within that target is covered. And then the complementary indicators, as its name says, would be complementary. For example, I don't know, if we look at for pollution target, then we'd look at the impact, the clean water impact that it has, or something like that. The framework has more than 340 indicators currently, with 47 headline indicators and 19 that are not operational at this time. So a large task to ask for countries to report on, even for developed countries. So I can't even imagine how it would be for developing countries. I will get back to later about our position, but as you can hear from what I'm saying, is that we feel it's a lot. The paper also suggests a baseline against which we should be reporting progress. So a baseline would help countries know where that starting point is and how are we making progress against our targets. There is currently a proposal to have a baseline for 2020, but I know that, for example, some developing countries are suggesting that a baseline could be pre-industrial era, because that's when kind of the shift has turned. So there's still a lot of debate on that, but again, you need data and you need information to support this. And so there's always this push and pull between we want a robust, something that's robust, that's ambitious, but that's also realistic. It's an application. And then all of this, once we adopt at the global level, we'll need to develop or undertake at the national level. What is going to be our national responses to this? So this is what we call the NBSAP, National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. For the last Aichi targets, parties had 5 years to develop and adopt their NBSAP. Now, if you think about it, if the Aichi targets are good for 10 years, that only leaves parties 5 years to implement their NBSAP. So that doesn't leave you a lot of time. So this time around, in order to increase ambition, parties are suggesting that their NBSAPs should be updated or refreshed within 2 years. So that is an interesting proposal that would help us, the global community, raise ambition and start implementing actions earlier on. And so now within Canada, how do we do against this global process? Well, as mentioned earlier, within Environment and Climate Change Canada, we're the lead for that, to follow up that process on the CBD within our team, but we also cover other multilateral environmental agreements, such as CITES on endangered species, Ramsar on wetlands. So we try to have like an encompassing view of all of this. But within our team, at least, our focus is really about the CBD. When we knew that this was coming, so in 2018 we decided that we would form what we've called a multi-stakeholder post-2020 discussion group. That's a mouthful. Where we have invited everyone in Canada who was interested to have discussions about what a post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework could look like, was invited to join. So other government departments, provinces and territories, non-governmental organization, industry group, national Indigenous representative, youth organization. Everyone that was interested in having those discussions was invited to join. You're still invited to join if you want. The process is still happening. So if you are interested, I can put my email in the chat after my presentation, and you can send me a quick email to let me know. What's interesting about this process that we've had is that it's under what we call Chatham House rules, so that no comments are tied to someone, and we're not going against you after you've said it. So it's very an open space for exchange of ideas, and we're trying to make sure that it remains that way and that people feel free to engage and present their opinions and their views on this process. And so we're hoping that this has resulted in that, actually. So we've done this through 3 phases. Phase 1, I'll try to be quicker a little bit. Phase 1 was maybe a little bit more of an introduction to the process. What was to Aichi, how it worked, what did the structure work, where were the gaps, and so on. Phase 2 was mostly in 2019. We went into discussing each of the Aichi targets in detail. Do we understand what this term means? What does it imply? Where should we work better? How is this complementary to other targets, and so on? And we're currently now in phase 3, where we've heard what people thought, what Canadian wanted for a future framework, and we're kind of reflecting this over to what is being proposed at the global level by the co-chairs, by the open-ended working group. So it's a little bit more of a passive engagement, but still we're always open to having your views and your proposition on anything that is being presented to parties at the global level. So what have we heard in that process? Well, there had been some varying levels of support, but overall we've heard that Canada should strive for more ambition for the global community. We should strive to have a better alignment with other international agreements. We should strive to have targets that are smart, that's measurable, agreeable, that are science-based. We should try to keep the structure as simple as possible, and we should try to address the gaps that we've highlighted during the discussions. And so, turning this into a little bit of a reflection of the updated zero draft that I've presented earlier. What's our initial reaction to this based on what we've heard and based on the discussions that are evolving? Well, of course, we still feel that this new framework should be ambitious. Nature needs it. Nature is not in a great place right now. And the level of action that is needed to reverse this trend should be reflected in this framework. We feel that it should be kept as simple as possible, with a focus around the core mandate of the CBD and the 3 objectives. And as I said earlier a little bit, and you got a flavor a little bit, we think that the current structure is overly complicated, with vision, milestones, targets, indicators, and so on. So we're trying to look at possibly eliminating the 2030 milestones and incorporating these elements into the target, and making sure that the flow of the framework will be as logical as possible. We want smart targets. We want them to be to have a numerical element whenever science can support this, and whenever it matches the target. Of course, the context. We want to make sure that the targets will result in actual changes in the states of biodiversity and ecosystem services. We've been strong advocates globally and nationally for a target on protected and conserved areas. So protected areas and OECM, that's other effective area-based conservation measures. of 30 by 30. So 30% of land and marine that would be conserved by 2030. But of course, we recognize that this has to be that has to be done jointly with stakeholders such as Indigenous peoples. They are key in this, and Canada has been championing on this with our Indigenous and protected areas, conserved areas, IPCA. So we're trying to demonstrate and maybe a little bit not replicate, because it's very country specific, but trying to showcase what we've done and make sure that we can learn from this at the global level. And this ties very well into the other bullet just beneath it. We are very supportive of making sure that this new framework will be gender responsive and will encompass as much as possible Indigenous peoples and their rights to environment. This is something that is very important for Canada, and I'm sure for you guys as well as youth. I've heard the great message of the elder when we started this meeting. So I was very happy to hear that. But we recognize that ambition comes at a cost, and we'll have to also raise the ambition on a resource mobilization target. That will be very important. But we think that for this new decade, we should look at different ways of mobilizing resources, whether it comes from private sector or any other areas. We have to do this as a whole community. We can't just do it on our own. And as I said earlier, strengthening accountability, ambition comes with accountability. So we're very supportive of a 2-year for the adoption of a new NDSAP. And finally, I think it goes with what we've heard, and this is very important for Canada, is also recognizing the synergies between multilateral and environmental agreements such as the UNFCCC, and how there's co-benefits from solutions such as nature-based solutions to tackle these twin crises. So I think, oh yes, one last slide. So in terms of process, what's coming ahead? What should you be expecting for if you want to engage more? Then the very soon to come, actually within less than 2 weeks, are the formal meetings of the subsidiary bodies of the CBD, where we won't be negotiating the actual updated zero draft, but there will be a lot of elements that feed into that draft that will be discussed, including the indicators, including and how countries will be asked to respond nationally, and so on. So if you are interested in listening, the CBD website has a live YouTube channel you can listen in. At this time, our Canadian position have been finalized or are in the midst of being finalized, so it's a little bit too late, but for the next set of meeting that's going to happen in August, and of course COP in October, as I said earlier, we always welcome the views of youth and other stakeholders in our position, and like we've been doing in the past, we send out an open invitation to all stakeholders to actually join the Canadian delegation. There's many people here on this call today who have been part of past Canadian delegation that can speak to that. And you can actually, if you join the Canadian delegation, you can actually take part in drafting the position and influencing the position that are going to be presented at those meetings. So if you are interested in getting your voice heard, this is certainly a way of doing this, and I encourage you to do so. Lastly, I'll just point out that, of course, we're going to be asked to respond nationally to whatever gets adopted at COP. So there will be a national process that will start, that is about to start right now, but that will officially be launched after COP. To which also you can take part if you are interested in about our domestic response. With that, I will stop talking. I think you've heard me talk enough. And if there is time, I would be happy to take questions. If not, I will put my email in the chat function. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for your presentation. We do have time for one quick question. So Laura is asking, like, can you explain what is resource mobilization?
That's a hard one. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. Basically, resource mobilization is trying to find money to pay for the actions that we want to do for biodiversity. So there's a system that was created for putting all that money into one pot and then redistributing it to developing countries amongst principally. It's called a JEFTA Global Environmental Facility, where there's donor countries, mainly developing countries, and there's recipient countries, mainly the countries in development. And so resource mobilization is a big thing. It's going to be one of the major element of the framework where we have to have a decision on that if in order to have a framework that parties are going to be able to implement. We need money. That's what it is. Yeah.
Thanks once again, Vanessa. Wonderful presentation. So now I would like to introduce to our next speaker. Our next speaker discussing the reasons why young people such as you and I should have a chance to give their opinions is Joseph Tututsis. So Joseph is a founding member of the Canadian Youth Biodiversity Network. His experiences have helped him at various levels and jurisdictions of First Nation governance, planning, administration, and policy analysis. Joseph's work, experience, and education fall within the realm of First Nations comprehensive community planning, legislative initiatives, land management, and policy analysis on climate change and biodiversity. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you very much. Just want to check, how's my audio, everybody? It's good to go already. So thank you very much. I'm just going to open this up.
The audio's a little bit quiet.
How's it now? Better? Is this better? If I talk like this, testing?
Yeah, that's definitely a bit better.
Okay.
Not perfect, but.
Is it okay though?
If it could be any louder, that would be fantastic.
What if I max it out? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's much better. There you go. Thank you.
That's better? Okay. Alrighty, so I'm just gonna share my screen. Is the right screen showing up? I always have to ask, or is it the wrong one?
I think it's the right one with the Canadian Youth Biodiversity Network CBD structure.
Okay, great. Alrighty, well, thank you very much. Just want to thank all of the people who put the time in and the work into organizing this youth consultation. Thank you very much to Vanessa. It's great to see you. I also see Kelsey on this video chat. So thank you very much for everybody in the past work that you put in. Thank you to Alex. Thank you to Fallon, and forgive me for leaving anybody else out. But just excited to be here. This is always a wonderful space to play in. I've served on the Canadian delegation to the UN, to this convention at 3 different meetings. So I might as well just go back into it. Or before I do that though, I should properly recognize that I'm coming from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I've since moved back home to my home territory of Treaty 6 in Saskatoon, where I have been born and raised. The experience and some of the things that led me to participating on the Canadian delegation at the UN started with my time with the Assembly of First Nations. In 2018, I moved there to Ottawa to work as a policy analyst in the environment sector, with working on the Convention of Biodiversity after it became more of a priority based on issues related to Indigenous traditional knowledge and Indigenous ecological knowledge. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and more based around why we should care. I want to explain within the context of the Canadian experience of why it is that we need to pay attention to Indigenous issues, especially as they are painted against the backdrop of the current developments here within our country, both socially in our society, culturally here as well, and within legislative process, with UNDRIP also going through the legislative process in Ottawa. So we're going to explore a little bit about how all those different things are all interrelated and why they're so important moving forward. So I'm just going to go a little bit into the background. So the background on this convention, forgive me if I'm repeating anything, but it just means I'm on the right track if I am. It's a sister convention to the more popular United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, but far less politicized. So the CBD has been seen as the more technically proficient and efficient of the two conventions, in which more work is actually accomplished because of the evidence-based approaches within the interface of science, policy, and Indigenous knowledge, innovations, and practices. And quite frankly, the political stage of the Climate Change Convention just dwarfs this convention in its attendance as well. So the objectives within the convention have been three-pronged: the conservation and protection of biodiversity, so all plant and animal species on the planet; the sustainable use of bioresources, harvesting plants and animals. Here in Canada, that would fit along with the rights of, to hunting and fishing; the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from their use. And the two protocols are based around the Nagoya Protocol specifically, actually led in its negotiations by Canada. And this one is the one that's focused on ABS, but later backed out of it. And there's a reasoning behind that. I'm going to point us towards a resource that can teach us a little bit more about that context. And this has been based on differing views on the consultation process with Indigenous peoples in Canada prior to and around the time of its development in Nagoya. So here's the real opportunity that we had a chance to be a part of, for those of us who were on the delegation in 2018, when Canada was made co-chair of the open-ended working group on the Post-2020 framework. At COP14, the head of the Canadian delegation, Basile Van Have, was the head of our delegation, selected by his peers to be the co-chair of the open-ended working group on the Post-2020 framework. And actually, as of this year, Canada will have hosted the secretariat of this convention for its 25th year. The close proximity of being in Montreal provides close access and advantage to participation from young Canadians from all across. And I think it is something to be utilized for promoting education by learning about this interface of science and policy, and the intensive pooling of knowledge and resources is really something else to see when you get a chance to engage in the richness pre the pandemic era, which is a thing now. The CBD is not, once again, it's not highly politicized, but it actually leads to, I believe, accomplishing more tangible results on the implementation side of things. So the best practices for conservation and better negotiations, relatively speaking, than other spaces take place within this this convention. So it's encouraging to see all the folks who really care about this. The headquarters of the CBD, once again, are in Montreal, but once again, all of these different conventions and processes and bodies have their headquarters based in different countries. So just speaking to the UNFCCC's headquarters being in Bonn, Germany, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York, as well as the General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Council and the UN Office of the High Commissioner. So this is based in Geneva, Switzerland. So once again, having a convention that's based here in Canada is, provides tremendous advantage, I believe, to us to be able to participate and have access to the resources to be able to learn about this and how its implementation will go into the post-2020 framework. And as well as having a friendly government who is willing to include us into this conversation, I believe we'd be remiss if we didn't take full advantage of this. So just speaking to the CBD structure of itself, at the very top there, you can see the Conference of the Parties, or for short, the COP. And there are 196 parties to the CBD. Canada was one of the first industrialized countries to ratify this convention in 1992. The COP, or the COP, is the decision-making body of the convention. So these decisions are non-binding domestically, but this is where all of recommendations get turned essentially into international law. And the COP for this convention takes place every 2 years, as opposed to UNFCCC, which is happening every single year. So the most recent of these has been in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt in 2018. And it was actually at that COP where the Post-2020 framework was discussed in how it's going to move forward, who's going to be involved, and what the the different programs of work are going to be that take place through these couple of streams you can see down here, which are just a few of many. So this led to the creation of the open-ended working group. For if we have not really discussed that into its entirety, we're just going to take a look that the open-ended working group on the post-2020 framework, it takes into account the recommendations and the interventions from all of the countries that are taking place and all of these parties and these different stakeholders and different streams of participation, these different programs of work that come from policy-intensive meetings like SBI, science and technology, and the substa with big areas like agriculture, aquaculture, and this includes living modified organisms and genetic resources that would be relevant to Canada and its food systems and supply chains. So these are different things that I think we really need to be aware of moving forward, because as you know, the post-2020 framework is going to 2050. So imagine how much technology has evolved in my short lifetime of only 31 years. And now imagine where it's going to be in another 30 years. It's going to be exponentially different, and the impacts on society are going to be quite different as well. So the CBD responds to requests from the COP and provides support to the meetings through the preparation of documents and logistical arrangements. So that is the secretariat. So that is the offices that are, or that are the offices. Those are the offices. Sorry, want to be grammatically correct with myself there. That is hosted in Montreal. There we go. So this is some of the participation, because I felt it would have to be authentic for me to participate in this space, to speak from my knowledge and my own experience. So having the chance to participate on the Canadian delegation itself was very eye-opening and in many good ways. But also I had the, wearing the second hat of participating with the Indigenous caucus, with the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. So this has been the mechanism for participation at the CBD and at each of the meetings within the convention, because most areas have relevance to IPLCs, Indigenous peoples and local communities, and related groups, which are the CBD Women Caucus. So this is a great network that is comprised of members, strategic partners, and network. This is a network that provides a platform for sharing knowledge and expertise and brings together various sectors at looking at the convergence on biodiversity and women's and youth rights. So it's been really great to be a part of. And even at COP14, a decision mandated that the process to develop this post-2020 framework, that it be gender responsive as well, because all of those different things intersect and converge with the person's identity and the way that they experience all of these different external pressures. So the Global Youth Biodiversity Network has also often aligned itself with the Indigenous caucus in its positions. And this has been a really positive attribute of youth participation at this convention. The IPLCs had their greatest turnout, and this picture is actually of the meeting room where we went to every single day in the morning to discuss the coming agenda items for the day, who's going to be covering certain areas and attending certain meetings. And this is where we all convene and confer on all of these different issues throughout the course of those 3 weeks during the COP, which was very intense. So over the 3 meetings I was able to attend, I heard stories from folks who have been involved in the CBD for just about as long as I've been alive, and have worked in all of the other forums on Indigenous issues, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So just, I guess, touching on one of these things, we're going to look at, those are the classifications of the sociocultural regions of Indigenous peoples. And although this has been taken from the UNFCCC, this reflects the same dispersion of areas that are feeding into the entire body of work and these different experiences of Indigenous peoples from around the world. So the CBD was the first UN convention to explicitly include Indigenous peoples in Article 8J. And this has helped to set the course for international Indigenous engagement throughout the entire United Nations. So Article 8J of the convention, it led to the establishment of an ad hoc working group. So that's for the purpose of the Article 8J within the convention, which covers traditional knowledge, innovations, and practices of Indigenous peoples all throughout the convention and its implementation. So the corresponding formation of the IIFB, or the Indigenous Caucus, is meant to also facilitate the inclusion of Indigenous peoples within the CBD. And within the post-2020 framework, the parties must decide on what a new role will look like for the working group on Article 8J, which is comprised of Indigenous peoples around the world. The relationship of Indigenous peoples with nature determines, all of the different expressions of cultures and laws and resource and knowledge management systems, and also the socio-political institutions of Indigenous peoples all across the world in all these different places. So this relationship plays a fundamental role in the protection and conservation of ecosystems and species and genetic diversity. So all of these things are all intertwined, and we're going to keep exploring that throughout this presentation more so. And throughout the cases and reports that are presented in this convention, the world's last remaining forests and 80% of the biodiversity of the planet are found in territories that are managed, owned, and under the control of Indigenous people. So we're just going to have to try to look at it through the lens of that for the duration of this presentation and hopefully onwards. So once again, the UN was the first convention to explicitly mention the Indigenous peoples within the United Nations as a whole. It just led to, a cascading effect where the working group on 8J was made a reality at COP4 in 1998. The UN's Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues was then founded in the year 2000, and that's the one that's based in New York and meets every single year on Indigenous issues from the Climate Change Convention, from the CBD, and from all of these different processes that feed into achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and all of those different things. And after this, the years of advocacy also led to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, which was huge for a landmark. Canada retained its objector status to the declaration until May 2016. So, but during that time, at that time, Canada committed to a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership, and rooted in the principles of the declaration itself. So there's been a lot of good things, and we're going to show how that's all playing out today. So within the domestic context, UNDRIP is now in its third try in the legislative process to get royal assent and become integrated into Canadian law and policy. But we have to remember that it's already a provincial statute in British Columbia. So in the BC Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. So this was in 2019, you guys. In Bill C-15, which is currently underway in the legislative process, is going through its own process right now federally with much anticipation. The last two attempts, and sorry to bore you with all of the political terminology here, but the last two attempts were through private members' bills introduced by Romeo Saganash of the NDP. And keeping in mind that this third try is now being done as a government-sponsored bill. So it's actually being pushed by the government and encouraged, so which bodes well for it. And with that in mind, and this time around, it's being analyzed by Indigenous legal experts in Canada who have commented positively to the foundation of this new bill, being from the past two, even with improvements made for itself. So it has been clear that it will be implemented over a course of time with and alongside Indigenous peoples and not immediately affect legal frameworks on the duty to consult by government and industry with Indigenous peoples. So, and how that's relevant to the Convention on Biodiversity is that the CBD's Indigenous Caucus and experts from around the world have developed the Aquacon Guidelines, which are CBD developed best practices on impact assessments with Indigenous peoples. This is domestically overlapped in the area of in the more recent past Bill C-69 legislation, which affected a whole host of legislation, but three or four acts specifically. And this newly legislated protection and use of Indigenous traditional knowledge is for impact assessments and projects that affect their rights. So with all of these different converging processes and different timelines, and benchmarks that we see that are moving us further towards where we want to be as a Canadian society. These are important things to watch. So it's the reasoning why we need to look at this with some of that lens as well. So what we see here is an overlap domestically and internationally of how our domestic system of laws, the common law, regulations, and policies, they're all intertwined with international processes and communities of practice. So I don't want to touch too much on the UNFCCC, but what I really want to show here is that we need to be able to learn from other processes. And one of the great challenges of the countries of the former Commonwealth, and these are countries who are formerly of the British Empire. So we need to keep in mind that there are already Indigenous populations living here prior to colonization. So this would include Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. And especially here in Canada, the various levels of jurisdiction, the stakeholders of business, industry, governments, and rights holders, Indigenous peoples, they make for a robust and again, complex situation, repeating Vanessa's point to that, for implementing international commitments. How do these translate here at home? So we're gonna have to take some of that and translate it. How does that translate into the biodiversity targets, which we'll touch on later in the slides. So what we saw through the carbon tax system was a series of events that led to, provinces of Saskatchewan and Ontario taking the federal government to court. And what we saw there was different levels of jurisdiction who all agree that there is a problem with climate change. And, having, the carbon tax seen as a silver bullet for how do we, effectively combat the risks of climate change, and, protecting also at the same time who are the most exposed and vulnerable of the Canadian population to the effects of climate change. So all of those different complexities come to the fore and actually get exposed in a lot of that stuff. When you guys get a chance to see, if you've ever seen a documentary Before the Flood with Leonardo DiCaprio, he visits the oil sands in Alberta. And that is one of the things that of great note that's left out of that documentary, and especially with Elon Musk talking about the carbon tax as the be all end all somewhat, then they're not taking into account countries with histories like this. So it adds a totally different dimension, especially as Canada being, I believe, if not the first, one of the first countries with a chapter of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network in a developed country, and especially one with a multi-jurisdictional legal framework like Canada. So we need to take a look at it from that lens. So, and just to put it in perspective, there are 3 territories, 10 provinces, and between 40 and 60 nations and linguistic groups that have been identified in the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996. So across this, there are also 634 First Nations reserves and communities across Canada, and Inuit and Métis peoples, all with their own legal frameworks of operation, which affect conservation and policy implementation. And having the chance to have the Canadian Youth Biodiversity Network be a conduit for finding innovative ways to practice reconciliation in Canada. This would be a great attribute of the network and has great potential for driving domestic implementation of the Post-2020 framework of the CBD. And this is an approach that demonstrates this much needed approach in our generation and the ones that come after us on the path to 2050 and each of the benchmarks that come along the way, decade by decade. So now touching on our national biodiversity targets, the CBD adopted the Aichi biodiversity targets at COP10 in Nagoya in the Aichi Prefecture, Japan. These targets were agreed upon for the Decade on Biodiversity, it was branded, 2011 to 2020 period, which we've seen has come to an end. But we're still looking to the path forward for what that looks like moving ahead. And what will that entail after COP15, which is still tentative, but after COP15 in China? And this will start us on the path toward path forward to the coming decades on biodiversity and what that looks like in its implementation here in Canada. So again, how do we learn from lessons in different conventions and apply those lessons with wisdom here with what we know? So again, touching on what Vanessa had communicated about NBSAPs, these are national strategies, plans, and programs for the conservation and sustainable use. And they're also many targets within this convention alongside the sustainable development goals, like the elimination of poverty, life on land, sea, and many others, that touch on improving the quality of life in national strategies for implementation through these UN conventions, all throughout our national strategies. So when you take a look at, just quickly, the national biodiversity targets are expressed in 19 of those. They don't all translate straight across because they are specific to our domestic context, and 2 of them relate to Indigenous knowledge. So I'm just going to quickly jump ahead here. And this is one of the targets that deals with the customary use of bioresources, which in Canada, we have a body of constitutional law, treaties with Crown and First Nations peoples, Aboriginal rights and title, and conservation regulations, policies, and measures that are taken by government and Indigenous peoples, alongside NGOs and other actors in civil society. Canada also has its own domestic approach to how this is implemented here at home. But we also need to keep in mind that the 3 objectives in themselves of the convention include the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from biodiversity. And this would include areas like agriculture, different models of land management and conservation, and food sovereignty issues linked to hunting and fishing, which is quite frankly overregulated in many areas to the detriment of the relationships here in Canada, at times between stakeholders and rights holders. The First Nations Food, Nutrition, and Environment Study has indicated that one of the main drivers of the decline of consumption of traditional food sources by Indigenous peoples is, in fact, overregulation. The measures that are not implemented with the actual case law on the ground and the lens of constitutionally protected rights ends up being where that gets we don't implement the proper application of the convention or even our own constitutional rights framework here in Canada, just by that notion itself. So here in 2021, and this is just today I saw this, thought it was really noteworthy to include, the Supreme Court of Canada also ruled that Indigenous peoples in the United Nations can claim Aboriginal rights in Canada. So this is straight from the Supreme Court of Canada. So according to rights exercised within traditional territories of their ancestors. So this was a case that happened with a man from Washington State, from the Sinique Nation, hunting in British Columbia. And there have been several other cases that have taken place like that in Canada, where we have people from different jurisdictions or even from different provinces or areas without treaties who are hunting in treaty territories. So it's something definitely to pay attention to, seeing that that was from the Supreme Court of Canada today. So touching on Target 1 and IPCAs, and this is something Vanessa had mentioned as well. So just touching on this, Canada's Target 1, and this is a target that's very well documented in corresponds to HE Target 11, which is protection of at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine areas. And, Vanessa had said that now what we're actually looking at, because we've missed 2020, it's come and gone. Now we're also thinking about 30 by 30, 30% by 2030, which is, in my mind, is a reality. So we're just going to move ahead and see how IPCAs had been created by the time. You can see the report there. It's called We Rise Together. It came out in 2017. There was cooperation by several of the provinces and territories and the federal government in its ministries and departments and Indigenous peoples whose traditional territories and home territories they're created in. So this has been a bright spot on the progress that has been made in the recent past and continuing forward. So in the report, it was noted that protecting and conserving areas will also enhance Canada's ability to meet international conservation commitments, such as protecting 17% or 30 by 30, whatever it's going to be, while also protecting and implementing principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So how is this done? Currently, protected areas are categorized through a variety of ways. So what Vanessa talked about through the OECMs, so other effective area conservation measures, and these are some of them: the UNESCO World Heritage Sites and Biosphere Reserves. We also have national parks, provincial parks, conservancies, and co-management agreements. So these are all across from coast to coast to coast, and the flexibility gives Canada the ability to create a broader application for how we can move forward with Indigenous peoples while still meeting international commitments. So that's been a really great thing to see. So just tracking, I guess, the national targets, and I just wanted to point people towards these two resources, the GBO, GBO 5, the Global Biodiversity Outlook in its 5th edition contains the progress on targets by parties from around the world. And what this does is it showcases examples of the implementation that is happening around the world. LBO2, which is the Local Biodiversity Outlooks, has been developed by the Forest Peoples Program, which is linked to the Indigenous caucus at the CBD. So there's actually examples there from all over the world. And what this is meant to do is to address the gaps in the collation of information and all of the different cases across the world. And even within a country as big as Canada, like I had mentioned, there's a bit of a complexity when it comes to gathering all this information. How do we showcase it within its entirety? It's quite impossible to grasp everything. So some of the challenges in addressing these gaps, like they are the inclusion of examples, and they're similar to what we face in many other fields, which is the need for baseline data in many areas, but also the need to hold Indigenous knowledge, innovations and practices alongside scientific, technical, and policy interface as evidence-based solutions and within an evidence-based approach. Seeing that is now legislated in Canada as being a requirement for impact assessments on new projects and things moving forward. So it's going to be quite interesting. Human rights has been an issue that is a huge part of the history of Canada, but also within the convention itself, but it's something that a lot of parties really hope to address in different ways, in different areas. And we could speak a little bit to that, but I don't think time would permit. So while the report shows positive examples, they're not going to show the details of the many barriers that IPLCs face around the world in their commitment to living in harmony with nature, which is the end vision, right? Which to move forward to that, it's quite something. So this is something that's not included in the LBO. This is I hosted a webinar with Enactus and the Saskatoon Travel Council just about a month and a half ago. And this is a great example of organizations within Canada, Canadian-based companies and organizations and Indigenous peoples who are taking measures to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and also at the same time unknowingly implementing the convention within their own communities. So just to show these quick examples, and meeting the SDG of eliminating poverty, you see on the second bullet point, you got 1 million people who are now part of the middle class, essentially lifted out of poverty. So doing that, as well as tackling issues like food sovereignty and creating economic solutions where, you're creating jobs and also quality of life. So having clean access to clean water, all of those things we take for granted here. So going back to just with the economic solutions and these local examples, these are outside the CBD's formal processes, but stuff that's being done. There is the opportunity to address issues around food security and the overlapping themes in the United Nations, the Declaration of Indigenous Rights and several of the conventions, and especially to the sustainable use of biodiversity and the positive economic impact that can be felt at home. So these small to medium scale endeavors, like a greenhouse, commercial greenhouse, or even food forests, are examples of the best practices that you can see in the GBO. And when it comes to making sure that agriculture is having co-benefits within the community, and to address benefits to ecosystems and the habitats around them. So from an economic standpoint, small scale social economy also helps to strategically shorten supply chains in food systems so that there's greater resilience to external pressures, like the cost of shipping food, which is affected by the petroleum industry and the cost of shipping. This allows First Nations and settling neighbors and partners to enter into business partnerships that practice reconciliation and utilize collaboration on local and regional scales. This is enterprise resiliency put into action, which is needed alongside climate change resilience and adaptation in order to mitigate the risks along the way. So just taking a look at, a little diagram of what a food forest looks like, and the fact that this is being done here so close to home, to me really warmed my heart when I moved back to Saskatchewan. It's really cool to see. But the CBD has an entire program of work dedicated toward, different things like agriculture. And, there are lots of examples around the world of small scale sustainable agriculture. And a lot of people here are doing that work. So it's great to see these small to medium scale endeavors like planting trees and shrubs along the edges of fields and borderlines and in places that are not being developed. There's more connectivity between habitat corridors where species need to move in order to live and feed. So this would be elongate animals like deer, caribou, moose, and then you've got bison and many others. So it's a really good example of the kind of approach that's also taken with the Three Sisters farming practice. So this would be a synergistic approach where the total product is is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's of course this is an innovation of Indigenous peoples as well. So the corn, if you're not familiar with the Three Sisters farming practice, it includes corn stalks, beans, and squash. The corn provides a canopy, the beans enrich the nitrogen in the soil for uptake of nutrients, and the squash is integrated with the other two to grow in a way that creates that synergistic effect. And it's been pretty great to see. A lot of folks, even out in Eastern Canada, are tapping back into these ways of expressing their culture through the sustainable use of biodiversity. And lastly, what we just touched on was the micro level approach to economics. So we're just going to take a look at how it intersects with the macro level. This is, just an example, I guess you could say, of the buying power of First Nations people. So this book was actually just released a little over 2 to 3 weeks ago, but the author is Carol Ann Hilton, the author on Indigenomics, just released her book, where she cited a study that was done by TD that showed the buying power of Indigenous peoples, organizations, and businesses to be greater than the GDP of the provinces of PEI and Newfoundland and Labrador combined. And this is just an example of the economic power of Indigenous peoples, organizations, and businesses here in Canada. And here in Saskatchewan, in the Prairie provinces, Saskatchewan in particular, there's an example where industry, Indigenous peoples, and economic development corporations alongside government are looking to invest into plant protein superclusters, where Indigenous peoples and First Nations are now participating in the path forward to address the needs of feeding growing populations and contributing on a scale that is at the macro level of economics in its orientation and has the ability to build out into areas that are linked to food supply chains and food systems. So what is a supercluster? Supercluster are areas of business and economic activity made up of many companies, academic institutions, and not-for-profit organizations that boost innovation and growth in a particular industry. And in this case, would be with a focus on food systems, but involving Indigenous peoples in Canada on a level that is inclusive of, but spills over and out of the use of TK, which is traditional knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. So it's not just limited to that scope. That's now it's including the entire approach of how this is implemented here in Canada to solve our problems together. And that's what it's all about, my friends. It's the reasoning why this is being presented. There's such great opportunities here at this point in time. So agriculture and food supply chains, the reason for this, have been globalized on a huge scale, which now entails more risk. In business, strategic sourcing and partnerships are a huge part of creating enterprise resiliency, which is something that is much needed in today's economic climate, where our national deficit it's so high. I don't even want to say the number of it. Contrast that with in 2018, where the federal deficit was, somewhere around 19 billion. But it's been an astronomical in growth. So seeing that volatility and instability is quite alarming. But luckily, we're trying to look at innovative ways and how do we address these challenges together, because it's easy to point out the problems, but here, how do we fix them together? So just to put that into perspective, I just wanted to communicate that. So just bear with me and the considerations of why we care. So I just wanted to put that into a nice little box for everybody to be able to see why, on the domestic side of things, how we implement this convention is going to have, be impacted by what's going on domestically in our own legislative process, in our own policy development. And keep in mind that 2050 is a long time away. So we're thinking, how do we piecemeal this thing and how do we take it one step at a time? And the implementation that's going to happen moving forward is going to take people from all different disciplines, academic institutions, First Nations, Métis and Inuit people, government at various levels. So we're going to have to keep that in mind as we're moving forward, because as I just pointed out early in this presentation, we've seen an upward trend and a growth in the acknowledgement of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how that relates to the context of this convention. So we need to keep that in mind in its implementation moving forward. So the convention has attributes, and this is a really cool thing, of the knowledge economy where best practices are they're shared across the world. So this includes growth in high technology investment and industries. So growth in knowledge intensive service sectors are education, communications, and information sharing. Knowledge spillovers happen from one industry to the next. And that's one of the things that you see within this convention when you take part in it is, the difference, the difference that you see in the siloed effect in many domestic approaches and internationally of how bringing together different practitioners of different fields of expertise and the interface that happens with policy, science, and evidence-based approaches, including traditional knowledge. So with that, how do we move forward with an ethical approach, and what is a just transition? This has been talked about for a long time, but how do we use an ethical approach to how we do this at home? And with that in mind, we need to keep in mind the history of Canada and the Indigenous peoples and their prior occupancy here for millennia, and the way that Indigenous peoples have lived in harmony with nature since time immemorial. So if that's actually going to be what we're striving for, living in harmony with nature, I suggest we become partners with Indigenous peoples, government, civil society, and the business sector. And I think that gives us the best chance moving forward. So it's what I have to offer. And some of the resources in this area where you can find a lot of this information is GBO5, like Ed pointed out, LBO2, and then you've got the CBD in a nutshell. And that's been developed by the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. It's been a great resource just to be able to know the inner workings of the convention itself. And just a quick reference to Indigenomics by Carol Ann Hilton, just a pretty recent work that's been published. And number 5, there's Genetic Resource and Reconciliation, which I actually met 3 Canadian lawyers who were very involved. The author, or the editor, Chitty, was one of the presenters at COP14 on this exact topic, genetic resources, justice, and reconciliation. So this is where you can find out some of the history around the Nagoya Protocol, and you can find out you get a better sense for why Canada is not in that space yet and how we do that work domestically as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Joseph, for your presentation. Amazing. I'm not seeing any question in the chat, but participants, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and Joseph is here with us and he will answer the questions. So moving forward, now Alex will take over from here and lead the discussion session.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen with everyone. So this part of our day is going to be dedicated to our discussion and consultation. Sorry, I would like to share my screen, but the little bar at the bottom for Zoom is not going down. Today we're going to be just a little consultation. It's going to be a stepping stone for tomorrow's consultation. It'll be a little bit more of a deep dive. But today we just want to bring it back all together of what does biodiversity mean to you? It's probably been a very overwhelming day for some of you just because it's a lot of information and we understand that. So feel free to put as much feedback as you would like. Francine is going to put the link in the Jamboard for the chat. But we're going to highlight the overall theme of what does biodiversity mean to me. We'll be asking 3 specific questions. The first question is, what is my relationship with biodiversity and nature? What is a priority for youth? How am I relying on nature and depending on it? And how does my lifestyle affect nature? So we'll have 5 minutes for each question, 15 minutes total. I'm going to switch my screen share to the Jamboard, just so that if people are a little unfamiliar with how to use it, I can show you. So Jamboard is a very interactive tool. On the side here, you have a sticky note function. You can click it and write whatever you want. I am just writing something super generic. You can pick a color, and once you hit save, it goes to the screen. If you don't like what you said, you can just delete it. And if you would like to input a picture, you can add an image if that's how you're feeling. But we're going to start ahead and ask, what does biodiversity mean to me? If you would like to say a sentence, a phrase, a word, all is accepted. If you feel that you would better be expressed through words and you would like to unmute yourself and talk through some of your experiences and stories, we would love to hear it. So this is a part of the call where we want to hear from you and your experiences. I hope that's clear. I'm going to, you guys can open up. You don't have to wait for me. You can start with question 1. I'll put a little timer on so everyone feels more comfortable. And once 5 minutes hits, I will kindly ask you to move on to the next question. Great. Does anybody want to share verbally their experiences? Again, you don't have to. We're trying to create a safe space and different opportunities for feedback. You can also make the sticky notes bigger if you feel like your sticky note looks a little small.
There's some really great answers. Source of health, I really like that. Source of well-being. Generations.
There's a lot about connection and, feeling that connection to nature, that acceptance.
This is all amazing. You guys have such insight in different perspectives. It's great.
I think about this a lot, how protecting biodiversity seems like a solid way to protect our future in terms of the next generation and the idea of whether to have kids or not. Is that a good idea, or what kind of world are we leaving for the next generation is so linked with biodiversity. I think about it a lot.
It's absolutely true. I think a lot of decision makers, since they're older, they don't see as far into the future as us, just because we have to see that far. So it's good to have youth at these tables because they provide a different perspective into these issues.
And also now with, most people living in urban areas, that connection with nature has been severed for a lot of people. So just seeing that comfort and that peace that youth have when they actually do get the opportunities to interact with nature, I think is, very important to know.
Mm-hmm. If you feel like you have answered the question to the best of your ability, you can move on to question 2. We have about a minute left on this question, so don't feel rushed. Take your time, think about it. Whatever your opinions and concerns are super meaningful to us, and it's very valuable for our work.
Yeah, and it's also an emotional thing too. So if there's even just an emotion that you feel with these, feel free to write it down, because as we do see a lot here, a lot of people feel connected to nature, and when we see it being disintegrated like it is, it does affect us and how we are living.
Great. How about if we haven't already done so, you can move on to question 2. We have another 5 minutes scheduled. So this question is, how am I relying or depending on nature? Everything. Accurate. Is there any specific things when we say everything? Is there anything specific that you want to highlight that you feel should be brought to attention? Because we would like to conserve everything. A little hard to, and lack of resources too. So if there's anything specific, how you rely on nature, it could be something contributing to your mental health. It could be basic for your dog or your animals at home. Hobbies, yep, photography, that's great. Hiking. I specifically rely on it for mental health.
I like the idea of everything, because like when I look in my bedroom alone, absolutely everything here has taken a toll on nature or derived from nature. Either because it's made out of wood, or the transportation, or the fact and everything on my desk right now requires oil to some extent to make and to get me here. So I think we're both reliant on nature, but everything we do takes a toll on nature.
There won't be ever a moment where we don't have an effect on nature, but it's just the matter of minimizing it. Hopefully that, for the next generation and future generations after us, that they won't, be too heartbroken of how we treated it.
I think that's a really nice message that Kim, if everyone was here for the introduction, stated too. She was saying, she was apologizing for the actions of people before us and how it affected our ecosystems, nature. And she really highlighted how we have the power to kind of change things now, and our voices do really matter to do that.
I think a really good point is the ecosystem services point. From an economic standpoint, this is something that I don't think that conservationists mention enough. And also, from a preservation and political standpoint, economics are very important. So the fact that, nature isn't just beautiful, and it doesn't just help our mental and physical health, it also helps our economy, by having having strong ecosystems, having pollinators, having clean water, all of those things are invaluable.
I love hearing other people's works or research or feelings about this, because it's really a cross-cutting issue and there's no wrong answer when it comes to protecting biodiversity. Great, we have about a minute left. So if you have any final thoughts, feelings, opinions, please don't be afraid to put a sticky note. We'll make sure to get everyone's opinions when looking at this when we write our report. And if you feel like you're ready to move on to the next question, please feel free to. That's our timer. If you guys can move, or everyone can move over to the third question, which is, how does my lifestyle affect biodiversity? We're looking, if you can provide specific answers, you can talk about fast fashion, like whatever you feel that about your personal lifestyle and how it affects nature. We would love to hear it. It is interesting to know how everyone working at home during the pandemic affects nature. So I like that point a lot. It's one I didn't think about. Anyone has some stories that they would like to share about how their lifestyle affects nature, we would love to hear it. It's a judgment-free zone.
Well, I'm just thinking there was a comment there on overconsumption and, food waste. And I think that's something that we don't really consider a lot. And, you do see it, especially now where people just buy, and they hoard, especially when the pandemic started. And then they had to end up throwing everything away because things go bad. Vegetables go bad, obviously. And we unfortunately throw food away. We don't really think of the impact that has, right? But that's a really interesting point I'm seeing a lot.
I find the toilet paper scare when that was happening very funny, just because there's a lot of places in the world where they don't use toilet paper, they use different. What happened? Okay, I don't know why the screen went blank. I really no clue. Luckily, this is all recorded, so none of your responses have been fully erased. So not to worry. I have no idea what happened. If someone deleted everything.
It's okay. I got a screenshot of everything.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
we're
Keep adding.
It's fine in mine. I can see all the comments in mine.
Can you? Maybe it's just
Yeah, when I go through the different pages, all the comments are still there.
even on the third page. Sorry, everyone.
On the third page, yeah, on the third page, there's a little bit less. There's 3.
Yeah. Okay. It was a full page, and then
Right, it seems somebody have deleted everything on the third page because it was all filled out, but I can't see anything right now.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So
we're able to restore the previous version. I just don't want to get rid of any of the new answers, but we do have all your answers recorded from everything else.
So not to worry, everything will be saved. One of the beauties of Jamboard, I guess. But we have about a couple seconds left, so if anybody could record their final thoughts. Again, none of your feedback has been erased. I have no idea what's happening with this. Okay. Okay. All right, so Francine has screenshot it before it got deleted, so she can share it in the chat if anyone wants to see it. But now that we've gone through the first part of the consultation, I want to check in to see how everyone's feeling. If there's any lessons that you've learned from just even seeing other people's answers, we would love to hear it. If you guys want to turn on your mics and have a discussion, we absolutely can. All of your thoughts are very important to us, just because it's going to give us a better report and a much more in-depth discussion. Good old Jamboard. Okay. Well, I'm just going to continue with the next part of the consultation. I'm going to share my screen again with our presentation. That was really the last part of our day. So again, in the comments, please, if you can share how you're feeling, one thing that you've enjoyed, and one takeaway from today's consultation experience. Whatever we've put onto the Jamboard, and we will load back all the comments that you originally put. Whatever you put on there is going to be the starting point for day 2's consultation. And it's going to lead into a systems thinking exercise led by our coordinators, Fallon and Laura, who are on our call today. All of your thoughts are incredibly important to us again. So if you can, stay tuned for day 2. And if you feel that we haven't answered your questions, or you just have additional questions, or you want to get involved and join CYBN as a member, you can email us at givencanada@gmail.com, or visit our website. But yeah, that's our consultations. Sorry for the weird ending, but please, let's kick ass. Sorry for the swearing. We're youth. We should be fully motivated. Like, we can do this. So I want to thank everyone for joining our day 1, and sorry for the weird ending, but we just got to roll with things. But yeah, if you share anything that you would like, we would love to hear you guys.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, and make sure that you're tuning in tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern Time for the second day of our consultation. And once again, everyone who sessions gets a certificate.
Thanks for the reminder on the time.
It's 9 p.m. for us Westerners.
9 a.m. Not p.m.
9 a.m.
Let's not get them in there late.
Great.
Awesome. Love seeing all the comments in the chat. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
If anyone likes to stay on the call to have a chat about what they've learned, we can absolutely do that. We did have this call scheduled to 7, so no worries.